Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Dr. Peter Ballerstedt is a returning guest on our show. Check out his first appearances on episode 62 and 630 of Boundless Body Radio. Dr. Peter Ballerstedt, otherwise known as Don Pedro, the Sodfather of the Ruminati, received his Master's of Science from the University of Georgia. He received his Ph.D. in 1986, specializing in forage management and utilization, minoring in ruminant nutrition. Peter is an advocate for ruminant animal agriculture and the essential role of animal source foods in the human diet. He strives to build bridges between producers, consumers, and researchers across a wide variety of scientific disciplines. He is a member of several national and international scientific societies, participates in related global initiatives, and is the former president of the American Forage and Grassland Council. Peter's study of human nutrition is fueled by his own personal experience. This knowledge, combined with his forage background, led him to become an advocate for ruminant agriculture and the essential role of animal foods in the human diet. He is a very popular speaker and presenter, having spoken at many international events. Dr. Peter Ballerstedt, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
Well, thank you, Cassie. It's a joy to be here.
It's a joy to host you again. It's always a joy to see you and see you in person, which I just got to hang out with you in Las Vegas, which is fantastic. I realized about a minute and a half into the introduction, I forgot to confirm something with you, and I knew I was in trouble. So I made a game time decision and just put a word in, and I'm not sure if I did it correctly or not. Are you the former or are you the current president of the American Forage and Grassland Council?
Well, I am a past president. There is someone who served after me who himself is now passed. So he's
Got
the
it.
immediate past president. I'm one before him.
Okay.
So a past president.
In the introduction, it says current, and I was thinking, I'm pretty
Hmm,
sure he's retired from that. So I decided to change it game time and coin flip, I guess,
perfect.
correct.
Perfect, Casey. I'm sorry for any miscommunication.
No, that's fine. I must be using an older version of your introduction. Like I said, we just got back from the Las Vegas conference that Dave Feldman put on, which was incredible. He did an amazing job, just like he did last year, which was his very first year. Hard to believe the quality of the conference is so good, having only done two of them. And as part of that, you were involved in the conference in I would say, a very friendly and cordial debate, which I really loved and appreciated. And you and I talked after that debate, and talked about the content that was shared around in on that stage. And I think that'll be an awesome topic for discussion today. But before we do, I just want to know if you have any other highlights or anything that stood out from that conference, including the premiere of the Cholesterol Code movie.
Well, I think it's also fair to point out that one of the reasons that it's such a wonderful event is because of the work of Sharon, making sure everything runs smoothly and she's got it all organized. And like many of us, Dave married up.
Well said.
Um, yeah, I don't know if there's going to be another one. If there is, go. That's the shortest thing. It's a worthy cause. And yes, watching the documentary was a great way to start it the night before everything kicked off, to see that journey. And I guess, there's something that's kind of bugged me all the way along. And that would go back to, 2007. But basically, here's this huge community of people who, by all measures save one, are getting healthier or are healthy, right? They're improving their health, or they're physically fit, or what have you. And yet there's this one thing, and it freaks everybody out. And we really don't know as much about it as we think we do when everybody freaks out about LDL cholesterol. And so here is this engineer who came into this space because of his personal experience. I'm speaking, of course, of Dave Feldman. And I remember him showing up at one of the meetings in Colorado when he had his first spreadsheet and he was showing his first data and the first inversion where and he was just showing it to anybody, and I remember when our little boy Dave, and to see what he's accomplished, can serve as an encouragement to us all. And to have a small idea of what he's faced and gone through and accomplished. I was just pleased to be a part of it. The documentary, when it comes out, watch it. That, and looking forward to watching it again because I'm sure I missed things going through it.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to stay with Robin Dobbins, who was featured in the documentary along with her family, Matt Dobbins. The three of us have become quite close over the years attending these different low carb conferences. And luckily, they were able to bring their daughter, who was also featured in the documentary. And in the car ride, the Uber that we took back to our place afterwards, you could tell that the daughter felt a little bad about her response to a question where she was asked, what memories do you have of your mom as you were growing up? And she just very honestly said, I really don't have a lot of memories. And again, in the car, she was like, that came off a little harsh and was pretty rough. And we all said the same thing. Like, that was an incredibly honest moment. You could hear a pin drop in the theater when she said that. And knowing that, like, all this research about cholesterol and the impact it has on our loved ones, people we love and care about, people in your world that are doing ruminant agriculture that think they're producing a product that is bad for themselves and is bad for the people. That's a real problem. That's a big issue. And so, yeah, I can't say enough about the work of Dave Feldman and all the amazing people in our community who are crowdfunding him, crowdfunding studies, supporting him, attending these conferences, which is also a way that people can contribute. So I just so much respect for him and what he does.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's harsh but necessary for us to see how, even though it isn't something we chose, so I'm going to relate this to my experience in addiction, alcoholism. It's I know that it could be controversial. Let's just say for purposes of the point that you don't choose to become, but you are. And then at some point you have to see what that has done to people. And if we're in our right thinking about it, then we can use that as leverage to keep us doing what we need to do to stay on this new path. Call it recovery, call it wellness, call it whatever. And yeah, it's not always easy to hear how this affected those close to us and many, many others. And, I'm preparing a presentation for an organization on the ethics of animal food consumption. And I'm not an ethicist, right? Um, on the other hand, I have a hard time talking about ethics at the same time that I'm talking about a situation where there's so many misinterpretations, misstatements, outright falsehoods, and human lives are being diminished. Right? You can tell when idols are being worshipped because people get sacrificed. And this is going on right now. And for any number of excuses or explanations. One of the things I've learned by preparing for that presentation is, ethics is a group decision. Morals is what we individually choose to do, right? But ethics are decided by the community, by the society. And I'm sure somebody could take me to task who's a philosopher, and that's not my interest or purpose. I have a site or a reference I can lean on. But it helps me understand I have no interest in, forcing somebody to change their personal decisions. On the other hand, I have very little interest in allowing a very small group of people to force their position on a much larger group of people. And when I look around the world and I see the impact of malnutrition globally, then I get interested in what we have to do to alleviate that problem.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we just so much appreciate your work in in the space. I came from this obviously more from the nutrition side, and probably most of the listeners came from this more in the nutrition side. And you having coming from a different background, obviously you and I have talked about your personal story before in our first episode in particular. So I'd refer anybody to go back there. But I do want to ask you what it was like back in 2007 when you had been working with ruminant agriculture for a long time, and all of a sudden this different kind of message about human nutrition came along. What was that like for you to kind of make the realization that the things that you were interested in professionally could also be something you'd be interested in personally, and you could be the one to build the bridges back and forth between these groups?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much all of that came anywhere near at the same time, right? It's been an evolution over time. I can look back through the course of my career, going back even to graduate school, and remember instances where people tried to give me information I wasn't ready to receive. I mean, that goes back to an emeritus professor in the early 80s who was trying to say, you know, and this was an animal nutritionist, and he was trying to say, these dietary guidelines aren't that well sourced and founded, and he did it in the way that he felt he could within the setting he was in, and of course we disregarded him because he was emeritus, he should have retired, blah blah blah. And I owe him amends, which I can't make in person, so I'll try to do it, by paying it forward. When we get to 2008 and I read Good Calories, Bad Calories for the first time, and I realize just what took place over that period that's described of how we came to believe one thing and changed to another thing, and what that change was based, I got mad. I got angry.
Good.
In large part, I guess, because of the feeling, well, nobody likes to be deceived, but also because it felt like the people, the industry, the colleagues that, I'd been trained to serve or who had trained me had been unfairly accused of being a health hazard. And so after I got over the anger, I just said, okay, well, what can I do to help spread the message, one, of metabolic health, right? And more people need to hear of the possibility to achieve drug-free remission from any number of conditions. I just had a conversation where I believe, let me see if I can get to that, because it was kind of, the numbers are pretty striking. 40 conditions, 4,800 peer-reviewed articles. Oh, really? Okay. So I can't think of any approach that would have a more profound impact on public welfare and
Wow.
the flourishing of our brothers and sisters around the world. And so over time, I realized back in 2010 that I could show up at metabolic health conferences and obesity conferences, and I knew things that professionals who were attending there did not know on both sides of this bridge. Like I was quoting back then, I quoted someone what Gary Taubes was going to say in his 2 lectures that were coming up. And 3 days later, when he said from the stage, word for word, what I had told this person he was going to say 3 days earlier, they turned around and looked at me. It's like, it's okay. And then we had the conversations, and they found out what a ruminant was and what forage was and why that's important and why I'd be there, and we had conversations about that. So I realized that I could be this person that stood between various disciplines and help sort of connect Um, because part of our journey as we go through graduate school or professional training is we tend to learn more and more about a narrower and narrower subject. Until we've built this great silo, we've lost the connections. And then I heard a professor from Germany say we need to stop building silos and start building lighthouses.
Mm.
And there's a whole lot of darkness in the world. And a lot of that involves illness. And it's not always metabolic. And, we've had colleagues who ended up passing away from chronic illness, and we can only assume that they were following the sort of diet that they talked about. It's not a panacea, but the quality of life that they lived was such, and what they did to help other people was such that that is a worthy, an aspirational goal for me. As I said to someone recently, I want to hear the phrase, well done, good and faithful servant. So, as I said, it's evolved over time. Um, and now I've gotten to visit many other countries and talk there and learn what they're doing in their agricultural systems. And I just find, tremendous excitement and encouragement there. So I continue to learn about what I was trained in, and then of course I learn every time I show up at an event like COSI.
Yeah. Wow, that's fantastic. That's so well said. I think that's absolutely beautiful. I'm thinking you mentioned all the studies, the number of conditions, all that stuff. And I learned a few months ago that if you go to Google Scholar or whatever the Google where a lot of medication or publications come out, you can, excuse me, you can search a keyword and it will automatically send you an email every time there's enough new papers that have that keyword.
Hmm.
Peter, I have to tell you, it's annoying. I get an email like every other day with more new studies. Like it's like drinking from a fire hose. And at that same time, you're right. Like getting this information out there. I've been talking about this a lot this week. A longevity author, everybody would know, has a podcast. He does a 2.5 hour discussion on insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And you can go and look it up on Apple Podcasts and scroll down to the transcript and go ahead and just search the transcript for things that you might expect to find in a conversation like this: diet, nutrition, carbohydrates, keto, and you will be stunned that the word nutrition comes up exactly one time. They're talking about pharma and medications and the newest stuff down on the block, and it's like, why can you not just start with nutrition and then use the other stuff later on down the road? So getting that information out is so critical, and I'm so glad you've made that part of your mission.
Hmm. Well, it's almost as unsurprising as searching the dietary guidelines for words like amino acids.
Yeah, crazy.
And
Yeah.
yeah, that's a point that we perhaps could get into.
Let's definitely get into that. I do want to talk about this debate that you had, and we can talk about some of the points that were brought up. I interviewed Dave Feldman after the last COSI conference, and off air, he was saying he wanted to bring some debates to next year's event. I said that would be good. Very non-confrontational type of a person, but if they're friendly and kind, I think that's a great idea. He asked if I had anything I would consider being debated on, and I had recently heard somebody defending seed oils as being a healthy thing, which I cannot even believe that's a thing. So I suggested that, but eventually, obviously, the idea came out that maybe somebody pro-vegan could debate somebody more in favor of ruminant agriculture and human nutrition. So how did the idea get presented to you, and why did you decide to accept it?
So you're the one.
Not as far as this goes. This is not me. It had nothing to do with this one.
Um, Basically, Dave contacted me and asked if I'd be willing to do it. And, then I'm unaware of anything after that until I saw the resolution. And I had a minor quibble, which was accepted. And then we went through the process that he had laid out for us. Um, so yeah, that's the background. It's the first time I've ever done anything like that. I've never been involved in a formal debate. And I've heard varying perspectives from people. Some wanted more confrontation, others were grateful there wasn't. So in that sense, I'm pleased. Anytime I've heard it said, anytime you give a talk, you end up giving three. There's the talk you plan to give, the talk you give, and the talk you think you should have given as soon as you're done. And so, I had to walk through that process. Um, but in the whole, I was happy to be able to contribute. Um, there were some things I wish I'd maybe done a better job of bringing out, but overall, I'm, as I said, I'm pleased.
Got it. Yeah, good. You should be. You should be very proud of the conversation that was had. I, for one, am very unconfrontational, so I am glad that it was at the level that it was. It was very respectful. And I have to say, I don't think anybody was like completely changing their mind one way or another. I think if you showed
Yeah.
up and you were pro-vegan, you're probably going to leave that thinking you're pro-vegan. Carnivores like myself are probably thinking like, yeah, I'm not really convinced one way or another. However, that said, should we call him your opponent, the person you were, debating with, Chris McCaskill? Did I say his name right?
McCaskill.
McCaskill. Thank you so much. Nothing but the highest respect for somebody like that to show up to what is clearly going to be a very high percentage base of people that are eating tons of red meat, that are eschewing
Mhm.
carbohydrates, and know their stuff and know their facts about veganism, that kind of thing. I have nothing but respect for him to be able to show up. Again, he didn't change my mind about anything, but kudos to him
Yeah.
to be able
And
to
his
show up and
generosity too. It's fair to point out that he gave a very generous contribution to the raffle. And like all the speakers that participated, his expenses were completely out of his pocket. So, that in that sense too, that should be acknowledged.
yeah, for sure. He kept saying like, I've got all these books, they're in the lobby, you can just come have them all the time. I'm like, what do you mean you've got books that you're just giving out to people for free? Like, that's really nice of you. I didn't take any, but yeah, anyway, I thought that was really interesting. um I don't know where you want to dive in as far as this goes, and where the debate kind of starts. I think the key point that I really like that you've said in conferences past is the idea that we need to shift to a plant-based diet. We're not plant-based enough. We need to move in the direction of being plant-based. You've made some really key points around that have really stuck with me. Maybe we could start there.
Well, yeah, and we could put those under the umbrella of what I call details, definitions, and denominators, right? I mean, the devil is in those topics. And so um, when someone says that, that they advocate for a plant-based diet, well, how plant-based? Right? The majority of calories in humanity's diet already come from plants, right? Over 50% of calories in humanity's diet come from rice, wheat, and corn. That's poor source of nutrition when you get to things like protein. And then the majority of our protein, in quotes, comes from plant sources, not animal sources. So how much more are we talking about? In Africa, for example, 7% of calories come from animal source foods. Well, how much more do you want? In the US, it's less than 30%. How much more are we? So those details matter. Um, I use two quotes from Dean Ornish, just making the point that I agree with Dean Ornish. One is that what's good for you is good for the planet, and what's good for the heart is good for the brain. Now, those are quotes that are attributed at least to him, and I agree with those quotes, but I very much suspect that we're going to differ on the details. In other words, I think what's good for the heart is a ketogenic diet, which then aligns with the work of people like Georgia Ede and Chris Palmer in metabolic psychiatry and metabolic mind. I absolutely, there is no sustainable food system without livestock, period, full stop. And especially so with ruminants as part of that system. So I think we want sustainable food systems. um, the grasslands are our most endangered biome, far more than the forests. The prairies at one point were described as the kidneys of the Mississippi, and yet those prairies have largely been converted into cropland, which then leads to, you should pardon the expression, downstream problems. Um, and, it's easy to sort of talk about some of these things and sound like you're casting judgment on our grandfathers, right? And that smacks to me of ingratitude. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And there were reasons, it's sort of like, what was it? Who was it that said, or maybe it was Chesterton, said, before I'll let anybody tear down a wall, I'll want them to tell me why it was there in the first place.
Mm.
And so people with very little understanding of some of these systems are very confident in what the solution is. And I understand that the rule of unintended consequences still reigns. Um, so all of those things are points that I wanted on the table and part of the conversation. Um, the last one to mention is just the concept of nutrient dense and nutrient density. And I would simply point to Amber O'Hearn's presentation from a few years ago, where she made the point that how are you what are the criteria for that? So if you're interested in nutrients per gram, then take a multivitamin, right? That's nutrient dense. Well, most of us would say, we'd rather our nutrients come from whole food, right? Rather than isolated components in a supplement. Um, the USDA and Health and Human Services in their dietary guidelines, they have an official definition for nutrient dense, and it's explicitly low fat because they don't consider fat a nutrient. And so the presence even of naturally occurring fats, the fats that come naturally as part of the food, are seen as only diluting the other nutrients that are provided. And so when people start throwing around a phrase like nutrient dense, I want to raise my hand and then point to the ludicrous example from the dietary guidelines where they consider sparkling water as being nutrient dense alternative to soda.
One of my
Or
favorite slides of all time that you used in a presentation. I love that.
so these are points, and then there's, sort of more, well, I do rely on the statement that humanity's existential crisis is too little animal source food.
Mm.
So, we have people who truly or otherwise believe that there are all these chronic illnesses that humanity is suffering from that are due to consuming too much animal source food. We could spend a lot of time talking about how they got to that belief. But on the other hand, I think there's high quality evidence of, in fact, it's the result of too little. And we can clearly see evidence in some populations of a lack. And after the later that night or the next morning, I met someone in the hotel lobby where I was staying, and they shared with me how all they're seeing in their medical practice is sarcopenic obesity. Obesity combined with a loss of muscle mass. Well, that speaks directly to amino acid balance and supply. And so that's in this country. We have we have reason to suspect that a significant portion of the American population is not meeting its essential amino acid requirements. And as I said, there's a difference between the adequate and optimal. And a lot of the guidelines are around adequate. And we don't really know what optimal is. And to be charitable, let's say that someone has a diet which will maintain metabolic health. And I think it's also fair then to ask, well, if you don't have metabolic health, is the same diet appropriate? If what you want to do is restore metabolic health, maybe those are two different diets. I'm an agronomist. I don't know. I strongly suspect that the diet that restores is probably one that's going to do a better job of maintaining. But that's, speculation on my part. And at the same time, we have the official document saying it's not intended for the treatment of disease. So I guess there's one more thing, and it just came back to me. And having once restored your metabolic health, could you then go and eat this other diet and maintain it? Or does something happen in that journey from health to illness back that means you couldn't eat that diet anymore, right? So those are three specific situations that I'm convinced we've done nothing to look at. I know of a researcher who formulated a diet based on the NHANES data. So they formulated a ration for growing pigs. Pigs are an accepted model for human beings. And they started this trial with a diet that would mimic the protein, fat, and carbohydrate macros of the typical per NHANES American diet. And the attending veterinarian stopped the trial early because he was judged that it was inhumane, that the condition of the pigs was suffering to the point where the attending veterinarian stopped it.
Wow.
Okay, so that's what human beings are eating. That's a concern, should be. And there's again, I'm preparing a presentation on ethics, and how do we have, again, I'm not an ethicist, but how do we have that conversation in the face of a conversation space where there's so much misunderstanding, misrepresentation, outright falsehood? And again, where human beings' lives are being diminished. I have a hard time wrapping my head around any conversation that would not account for that. And so, for example, you'll have people say that if we weren't using all this land for livestock, we could grow more of, and then fill in the blank, human edible crops. And there's several problems with that. I used the example of it was Super Bowl weekend. So I used the football field analogy. And if you start at your goal line, imagine that the football field between the two goal lines is all of the land surface of the world. And you go from your goal line to the 38-yard line. That would be the amount of agricultural land. Okay, but agricultural land isn't all suited for producing annual crops, by tillage, for example. So if you wanted the arable land, that would go from your goal line to the 10-yard line. Okay, but all of that land isn't of the same quality. A significant amount of it will be degraded unless you put in a lot of effort and resources by tillage and producing those crops. So the class 1 land, that's the land that's least likely to be harmed, would get you from the goal line to the 4-yard line. Okay,
Wow.
so there's a significant amount of the agricultural land whose only or best use is to have it in perennial grass or perennial plant cover and grazing it with ruminants that can turn that biomass into human utilizable resources. Number two in that is there's no either or here. That the livestock agriculture is integrated into that cropping system, even when it's on the arable or class 1 soils, so that in some parts of the southern plains, for example, they will plant winter wheat and then they'll graze that with cattle until sometime in the late winter spring when they need, if they want then a grain harvest, they'll pull those cattle off before the reproductive tiller that will produce the wheat head, before it elongates up enough to be damaged, they'll pull the animals off and let the wheat crop mature. Or they'll just continue to graze it. It depends on, all kinds of decisions. So that's an example of how it's integrated within 1 year cycle, or one cycle, because you start in the fall and end up in the spring. So it's 2 years. Another way would be if you have some rotation where maybe after 3 years you go into a short-term pasture. So now it's in the pattern, it's integrated. And then there's the integration that we have to acknowledge that the vast majority of the biomass that we produce in agriculture is not human edible. So even if I grow a crop of corn or a crop of wheat, over half of that biomass is not human utilizable. But we can run it through a ruminant. So there's that degree. And then, of course, when we process food or commodities into some other product, there's waste, there's byproducts, and those all find their way into livestock production systems. So again, and if you're a fan of organic production, where does your fertilizer come from? It comes from livestock. So all of those sorts of integrations need to be kept in mind as someone is then saying, we need to shift toward a more plant-based diet. Which means we're going to have to produce more crops because we can't just swap them one for one. And it ignores the idea that when I feed even a human edible product to a ruminant animal, what I get back is more valuable than what I fed in. So in fact, there's no feed food competition going on, despite what people say. So there's no land use competition, there's no feed food competition, and we're just getting started.
It's so well explained. I love that. And it was Super Bowl Sunday, and I love your football analogy. And I'm just wondering if the Chiefs had heard your analogy before they started the game, do you think they probably would have done a lot better? I heard yardage was not their strong suit that game.
It it would be hard to imagine them doing worse, but hey,
There you
some
go.
I don't want to get involved in anything controversial, so
Yeah, exactly. We're gonna get canceled around here. So that's the food thing is very, very interesting, and I think a lot of people miss that. And you specifically have also talked about, how we raise or grow, excuse me, almonds in this country, and how resource heavy that production is. And there's parts of the almonds that we can't use that ruminant animals can. I think that's one good example. If you could kind of highlight that.
sure. My line is you can't get milk from almonds, but you can get it from almond hulls by feeding the hulls to dairy cattle, which they do in California because they have an extensive almond industry, and the hull is the bit on the outside of the nut kernel, and that ends up being again a byproduct that would otherwise have to be disposed of, which would increase the cost. So that's just one example.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Arguments that were made, I think a lot of people have heard of or think about. One was the destruction and the clearing of land, in particular in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. And the numbers are quite scary. And they keep saying it's all for cows. And that I don't really know that that's actually the case, but that was definitely an argument against ruminant agriculture. Do you have any knowledge of that, if that's actually a thing or not?
Well, yeah, clearly it happens. There's been legislation to prevent it, and then you're left with enforcement and regulation issues, governance issues. My colleagues in Brazil have given me a perspective on it. And one of the things that's driven change across Brazil is the dominance of soy. And so you found a lot of pasture being taken out to grow soy, and also some of their native grasslands. Again, a pattern that we had in the prairie, right, in the plains. It's being replicated in other parts of the world as they rightly develop to meet the needs of their developing countries. But overall, the development pattern, once we get outside of the poor who are just trying to make a living and they go in and clear wood and burn and practice subsistence agriculture, but the large tract development, the use of that cleared land by cattle is a stage in the land development. In other words, the end goal is not to produce cattle, the end goal is to produce soybeans, right? And so the cattle are one tool to accomplish that. And similar things have happened in the US over time. Originally, the land in parts of Wisconsin was very poor, and it was by the introduction of dairy cattle that the productivity of the land improved and the livelihoods of the farmers improved as they sold, cheese and butter, or butter primarily off the farm, and then finally they ultimately they began supplying creameries that did the processing. So I think that while it's an issue, it's not as big an issue as is frequently represented.
That makes more sense to me anyway, just thinking about that logically. I have to point this out too. This is another argument against ruminant agriculture and human nutrition as well. That like we have nutritional guidelines not only in this country but in, I think you said, 108 different countries, and they came to very similar conclusions, kind of making the point that like, well, if Denmark came to the same conclusions that we did about nutrition, they did them independently. These are different people in Denmark who came to their conclusions. So how could 108 sets of nutritional guidelines be wrong? I mean, Nina Teicholz, Dr. Nina Teicholz, the angel,
Mm.
is in the audience. What can you say about nutritional guidelines as something that's supporting us going more plant-based?
Yeah, I think that it's fair to point out that there's been a belief system that's been part of dietetics from its very beginning, and it's global in its footprint, and it's fully incorporated into professional nutrition societies. So the fact that you would have that worldview represented across the world by different organizations populated by professional nutritionists, not too surprising. Um, yeah, the development of the dietary guidelines from anyone who has looked at that story, that certainly Dr. Teicholz, Denise Minger also wrote about it, Gary Taubes wrote about it. I'm not as impressed by the dietary guidelines as some apparently are. And I think a lot of it ends up as, I think I described it as a self-licking ice cream cone at one point, that, well, this says that this is a healthy diet. And so because we want to write about what's a healthy diet, then we'll write about the health. It's like it's circular in a sense. It takes on board evidence for, or points for which evidence is either lacking or extremely weak, and it does not self-correct. So there are a number of profound weaknesses, and it's interesting to go back and look at the sort of development of them over time. And how we went from one place to another. And part of this is now this self-reinforcing argument. Well, this we know is the healthy diet, and it's good for the planet too. So now you kind of have this, reinforcing each other, but even those arguments become questionable. I looked very recently, so part of this is this arc of understanding, where years ago there was the Livestock's Long Shadow document that came out with its estimate that over 50% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions came from livestock. And there's a story about of the flaws in that. The authors retracted, didn't matter, it's been cited for a long time. Well, the latest pegs that figure at about 12%. There's a difference. Okay, so then if you start breaking that out, and I did the spreadsheet to figure it out, if you look at the global greenhouse gas emissions from a total that come from livestock in the high income countries, you're talking about 3%.
Wow.
So even if you were to eliminate all of the livestock production from all of the high income countries, you wouldn't move the needle, except that you would then create imbalances in the food system, and you would exacerbate already existing nutrient deficiencies. You'd probably end up increasing, because then, due to our wealth, we'd end up importing those from parts of the world where they're not as efficient as we are in the high income countries. But it's important to recognize that over half of the cattle in the world are in Asia or Africa. Over 70% of the sheep are in Africa or Asia, and 98% of the goats are there. If you're going to move the needle, you need to look at the low and middle income countries. So you add those numbers up, and that's like 9% of total global greenhouse gas emissions, but it's the majority by far of the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock globally. And so we could, without any new technology, if we had the will and we had the resources and the vision, we could make a far greater impact in that area and improve the livelihoods of human beings in those regions. And a part that's not well appreciated is that the healthcare industry has an environmental footprint. It also has a social footprint, and it darn sure has an economic footprint. I mean, what could we do with over $4 trillion a year? That's
A
just
nice
US.
house.
That's, yeah, at least. We're driving towards an insane number for the whole world. And I have this vision of parts of the world where they never strung copper wire for telecommunications. They go straight to cellular, which means they skip fiber optic too, for the most part. And so we have this growing problem of chronic illness. It's the largest cause of death worldwide. Some would say that's from eating too much red meat, I would argue. And so there's a need for healthcare services. I would suggest the answer does not lie in replicating the US system. I would suggest that the answer in part lies with increasing the affordability, the availability of appropriate animal source foods in those parts of the world. And so if we could get people to have that vision and that idea, then we might actually be able to achieve what people who advocate many times for a plant-based diet say they're advocating for.
Right.
We could point to the studies, and it's, they're not apples to apples comparisons in terms of how they estimate greenhouse gas emissions, right? But I can pull out the reference for the paper that estimated that the US healthcare industry was a significant source of pollution, including 10% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the US. Now,
Wow.
very grateful for the US healthcare industry. We're really good at treating some things, not so good at others. I get it. But I'm really glad I have that as an option. So I'm not talking about getting rid of it, just like I'm not talking about getting rid of medications. I'm talking about better use case, right? And we know that our system is being overburdened by type 2 diabetes, obesity, and related manifestations of malnutrition.
Well, these are the unintended consequences that you mentioned earlier. And it feels like we're always on the defensive side when we're talking about these numbers. And we rarely talk about, going on offense and talking about how difficult and, again, resource heavy agriculture of plants is. How much land, how much water, what are you killing? What's happening to the insects? Like, there's, if you get rid of all the cows, you got to eat something. And again, it's going to be nutrient poor. And then there's all these other unintended consequences that are also contributing significantly to greenhouse gases and land and soil misuse and all kinds of stuff.
Right, exactly. I'm looking for a world food crops class, that you know. So let me drag this over to the side, and I'm sorry for interrupting. Um, we've 50% of humanity is dependent on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer.
50.
50%. So, okay, we're going to grow more cereals. That requires nitrogen sources. So that probably means more, and especially if you reduce the livestock, that reduces the manure that could be the source. Um, we've got, small and medium farms produce the majority of the world's food. And we're talking about 35% of the world's food comes from 2 acre or less farms. And some commodities at 75% in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and China. Over 75%, over 70% of the world's farms are in that 1 hectare, which is like basically 2.5 acres. So this is the world that we're talking about, and yet I think many don't have an adequate understanding, right? And things that happened as the US developed are happening in other parts of the world for the very same reasons. And so there was a legitimate reason for why those things happened here, which means there's a legitimate reason there. Now there could be problems as well, but what did I find here? In the 1990s, more than half of the world's cultivated land was worked by draft animals. We went through that transition by 1900. Just over 20, about 27% of the global population derives their livelihoods from agriculture, which includes livestock. So what people are entertaining has a ripple effect, right? And what are you going to replace that with?
Yeah.
You're going to buy everybody Kubotas to replace their draft animal. So that's just some examples of ideas that bounce around in my head, and I want to take advantage of the opportunity to invite people into this space to learn more. But the big thing, again, it gets back to a point I made very early, is we were in a room filled with people that were on some part of a journey of health restoration, either theirs or someone close to them. And there were some, to be sure, practitioners, but many of them had their own story, right? And so that experience has to be completely disregarded in order to accept this another worldview, right? That advocates for what many actually could say from their personal experience did not help them, right? What actually caused it? Okay, we could argue about that. But the fact is, they followed it and they became ill. And then they had a dramatic transformation and they got well. Well, it might be coincidence. But there were a whole lot of coincidences there that seemed to line up.
There's a
And
lot.
and then, as I said, there's certain misrepresentations or misunderstandings or misperceptions that are involved in the conversation space as well. And ultimately, if something can be shown to benefit so many people today, any projection about what's going to happen in 50 or 100 years becomes less interesting to me. And again, that gets us back towards ethics and that sort of thing. But that's the position that I occupy.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the three speeches, which I think is a great way to think about it. And of course, walking away from something like that, I'm sure there were other things you wanted to highlight or emphasize or de-emphasize. It's a difficult conversation to have because it's got these different moving parts. I like to try to organize these conversations and say like, oh, when we're talking about human health, we need to talk about human health. When we talk about the planetary health, that's over in this other bucket. When we talk about ethics and
Yeah.
morals and that sort of thing, it's another bucket, but they're all involved with each other.
Absolutely. They overlap and interrelate to each other significantly, but the worst thing for the environment is an impoverished population. Um, Again, if you want to reduce human impact, you do that by increasing human flourishing. Um, and we so take home messages. Oh, well, Ben Bigman's of cut the carbs, prioritize proteins, and don't fear fat. And and I want people to remember that all protein is not created equal. And some protein isn't even protein, right? And that gets us to a conversation we've had before. And so what that emphasizes is the role of animal source foods as a source of those indispensable amino acids in the form that's most utilizable in the proper relationship to each other. I just came across a paper as I was looking for information on amino acid deficiency, which was saying that the world is actually limited in the soybeans it can produce. And soybeans are really the only viable way to address some of these deficiencies other than animal source foods. And so human beings have herded and managed livestock in every biome that they've ever occupied, from tropics through Arctic. So we have far more resource available, and we can do it better, obviously. We can improve, obviously. But the fact is the fact. And people who choose to believe in fantasy are always disappointed in the end. So, glad to have the chance to talk. It does at times feel a little disjointed, but part of our challenge is simple solutions typically aren't solutions. And again, some of this stuff may not be knowable, but a lot of it is. And then you sort of add it all up and say, well, which way provides the greatest benefit to me and my family? Okay, I'll go that way. And the rest I'll leave to someone else.
Well said.
So
It's a great place to start a journey and a great way to end this conversation, Dr. Ballerstedt. I see so many people in our space really trying to make an impact. And oftentimes I think like, well, what can I do? I'm only one person. I look at you and your career and your life and how much impact you have had in your career as just an absolute beacon of light to all of us out there who are hoping to make a difference. You do such a great job of that. And I just really appreciate you and getting to know you in person, all the great time that you've spent with us on the show to be able to educate us and the listener. So I'm very, very grateful for you and all of your hard work. Where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work?
well, thank you, Casey. And again, pay it forward, right? I hope that's all I'm doing. So you can find me by name. Just search any well, okay. Instagram, X, Facebook, LinkedIn. You can find me there, on YouTube as well. And I'm not hard to find. There's not that many Ballersteds around. If you find one that's not me, let me know. There may be some kin I'd like to get introduced to. One of the exciting things that I was just on a call about is what can non-medical professionals be doing to carry this message of metabolic health to the wider audience. I jokingly refer to it as Project Operation Grassroots, regenerating public health. And so, from everything from our example that people get to see and say, what are you doing? How do you answer that? without being, the reformed smoker that everybody just, oh God, here you. Or, what do you take to the potlucks or the group, lunches? How do you act when you go out to eat? Have you learned ways that you don't have to be such a drama about? Or, what books are in your public library? That was something my wife Nancy taught me, and so go to your local the theme was citizen science, right? Well, maybe that starts with becoming better citizens. So what opportunities do we have in our local communities? And the library one is a good place to start, and go online, see if, I don't know, why we get sick. See if that book's in your local library. And if it isn't, see if there isn't some way that you could ask the local library to get it. And then, as somebody said, and then get all your friends to sign up for it. So there's a long waiting list for it.
Love it.
So
Good idea.
that clues people in. Oh yeah, this is a good one. We better get another copy.
I love it.
So those sorts of things, and then there are others that we could talk about at another time.
That sounds great. Dr. Peter Ballerstedt, like I said, so grateful for you and all of your work and all the practical wisdom and tips you've given us today and a lot of things to think about. So thank you, as always, so very much for your hard work, and thank you for taking time to be on our show today. Really, really, really appreciate you.
Thank you, Casey, for the opportunity. Thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you very much. That's high praise coming from you. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.